She had been running the scan for just under 2 hours by the time she reached the last name on her list. This was longer than anyone might have expected, had anyone known she was conducting the examination at all, which no one did because she had not asked permission. Madame Poppy Pomfrey had been the school's resident healer for 30 years, and in that time she had learned the precise boundary between matters requiring the headmaster's involvement and matters requiring only her own professional judgment. Health assessments of incoming students fell on her side of that boundary. She had not needed to raise the question with anyone because she had already settled it in her own mind, which was, in her experience, sufficient. 30 first years, 30 scans. The results were largely what she expected from 11-year-olds arriving after a summer of anticipation and a long train journey. The Paddle girl needed a course of Nutrifex for a deficiency that explained the circles beneath her eyes. Boot had a cold he had clearly concealed from his parents to avoid missing the start of term. She dosed him with a pepper-up potion and sent him back to Ravenclaw Tower, steaming gently from both ears, which she found privately satisfying. The Longbottom boy, Neville, born July 30th, round-faced and nervous, clutching a small potted plant as though it might make a break for the door, had an old fracture in his left wrist that had healed badly. She had asked how he had come by it. He said he had fallen out of a tree. She had written it down with a question mark beside it and moved on without pressing. Not every question needed answering tonight. That left one. She had found Harry Potter standing in a corridor near the Great Hall, looking up at a moving portrait, with the blankness of a child who had nowhere particular to be. He had followed her to the hospital wing without a word, and without a single question, not one, and had sat in her examination chair and been asleep within minutes. She did not mark this as alarming. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and he had had an exceptional day, and children fell asleep when they were tired. She set her diagnostic instrument to its quietest setting, and passed it gently across his forearm. The reading did not resolve. She passed it again, assuming interference from the evening's residual enchantments. The sorting ceremony always left a magical hum in the castle's field for several hours afterward, diffuse and low, the kind of thing that occasionally confused sensitive instruments. She recalibrated and tried once more. The display began to organize itself. It took considerably longer than usual. The fine lines of diagnostic notation arranged themselves into temporal strata, oldest deposits settling toward the base of the reading, most recent layered near the surface. She watched this happen for perhaps 2 minutes, and then she began to count what it was showing her. She counted 3 times. The first number seemed wrong, so she counted again. The second matched the first. The third matched the second. 47 distinct magical residue layers, compound class, mood stabilizing, affect modulating, loyalty binding. She knew this signature class. She had treated love potion aftermath twice in her career. 2 young people dosed without their knowledge, arriving in her wing confused and tearful. And she had once received a patient subject to a sustained compulsion hex that had left similar traces in the bloodstream, faded and strange, and clearly not their own. She was not unacquainted with magic that reached into a person's emotional architecture and altered what it found there. What she had never seen was 47 administrations of such a compound, layered across the entire developmental span of a single child. The oldest deposits were so deeply integrated that they had taken on the coloring of native tissue. She read the depth ratios carefully and estimated the temporal span. 10 years. He was 11 years old. She sat with that for a moment and did not rush through it. Then she checked the reading section by section and confirmed what she had. She turned her attention to the second anomaly, which she might have overlooked if she had not been looking carefully at everything. a structural binding woven into his bloodstream, not a residue from something long faded, but an active enchantment, thoroughly integrated, as though it had been placed there long enough ago that his body had accommodated it. It was built with a precision and intentionality that spoke of exceptional craft, and it carried a caster's magical signature. She recognized it. 30 years in this castle. 30 years of proximity, consultation, shared crises. She did not need to reason toward the identification. She simply knew it, the way she knew the weight of her own instruments, the way knowledge eventually moved past the mind into something less articulable but more reliable. She sat with the recognition for a full minute and did not allow herself to do anything with it yet. The third anomaly was in the scar. Her instrument had no classification for it. It had flagged the reading as anomalous and left it without a category, which was what instruments did when they encountered something outside their established taxonomy. The lightning bolt scar tissue on Harry Potter's forehead was producing a magical signature that was not his own. It was not his magic, and it did not match anyone in her records. And it read as dark. Not ambiguously dark in the way of powerful combat spells or old curses that had left traces and settled. Dark in a small, specific, and deeply unpleasant way she had encountered 3 times in 30 years, and remembered each time with undiminished clarity. She marked it in the display. Unidentified, dark origin, scar tissue. She set the instrument down. She looked at him. He was thin, not incidentally thin, not the thinness of a fast-growing child, but thin in a way she recognized from particular cases she had seen before, thin in the way that was recorded and measurable, that showed in his wrists and in the slight excess of fabric in his new school robes. The robes had been sized correctly from his measurements. It was the boy inside them who did not fill them as he should. He slept with the completeness of the genuinely exhausted. His glasses had gone slightly crooked on his face. His hands were open and still in his lap, the hands of someone who had, at some level below conscious decision, stopped expecting to hold anything. His face was calm in a way she did not entirely like, because it was not the calm of peace. She got up. She crossed to the hospital wing door and applied the locking sequence. 3 separate wards, more than she had ever used on what had been intended as a routine examination, and she did not pretend to herself that anything about this remained routine, and hung the notification standard in the doorframe. Wing sealed, healer in attendance, authorized entry by appointment only. She sealed the inner frame as well. She stood for a moment with her palm flat against the old wood, then walked back to her desk. She wrote 2 messages. The first went to the headmaster's office. It informed him that the hospital wing had been sealed following a first-year health assessment, and that the matter required his prompt attention in the morning. It told him that she was in attendance with the patient. It told him nothing she was not yet ready to tell him, which was accurate, and she sent it. The second she addressed to the Potions Regulation Division at the Ministry of Magic. She wrote it with the care she brought to documents she expected to be scrutinized, because she expected this one to be scrutinized very closely. She described the instrument findings. She used the correct technical classifications. She noted the compound class and the estimated number of administrations and the temporal distribution across the estimated span. She did not speculate about who had done it or to what end. She reported what her instrument had shown her, confirmed 3 times, with nothing added. She sent that one too. She sat for a moment, listening to the quiet after it went. The castle had settled into its post-midnight register, the deep, inhabited silence that Hogwarts made when all its people were in their beds, and it had no further work until morning, a sound she had always found in the 30 years she had lived inside it, something close to a comfort. Tonight it held itself at a slight remove from her, the way familiar things sometimes did when something large had changed without announcing itself. She turned off the overhead lamp and left the amber light on her desk burning low. She settled back into a chair with the instrument's report held in both hands, and the numbers she had counted 3 times, and the magical signature she had recognized, and the thing in the scar she had no name for yet. 12 feet away, Harry Potter slept. She stayed. The note arrived at 12:47 in the morning, folded in Pomfrey's precise hand, delivered by one of the castle's internal messenger systems that moved through the walls like sound. Dumbledore unfolded it at his desk in the office he had occupied for 38 years, beneath the painted eyes of the sleeping former headmasters. Most of them were genuinely asleep. 1 or 2 were not, and those ones watched him read. The note was terse. Poppy Pomfrey was not a woman who wasted words in any circumstance, and she did not waste them now. The hospital wing had been sealed, it said, following a first-year health assessment. The matter required his attention. She was with the patient. He read it twice. He set it on the desk. He went to the tall window that looked south over the grounds and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back. What unsettled him was not what the note said. It was what it did not say. It did not ask his advice. It did not request his presence. It did not express any uncertainty about whether she had done the right thing, the way communications from subordinates in a crisis usually did. A small professional hedge, a deferring question, a space opened for the superior to step through and resolve the matter. Poppy's note had no such space in it. It was a notification, not a request. It told him she had sealed the wing and that the ministry had been notified, and it told him nothing else. The grounds below were perfectly dark. No moon tonight. The lake was invisible from here, present only as a quality of darkness slightly different from the darkness around it. He stood at the window for quite a long time. Then he descended. The hospital wing corridor was dark and silent at this hour, the stone floor cold underfoot, the sconces dimmed to their nighttime setting, the notification standard hung in the doorframe, with the deliberate positioning of someone who had wanted there to be no ambiguity about what it meant. Wing sealed. Healer in attendance. Authorized entry by appointment only. He had seen that standard before, in the ordinary course of a school with several hundred children in it. He had never seen it in response to a first-year health assessment. He stood in front of the door. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound came back flat and dampened, the door's enchantments absorbing the echo. A silence. Then Pomfrey's voice, close enough that she must have been just on the other side. "I'm attending my patient, headmaster." "Of course," Dumbledore said. "Poppy, I think I can explain. You may explain at the inquiry." A pause, as brief and precise as a full stop. "Headmaster." He stood for a moment. His hand was still partly raised, the gesture of a man who had expected to knock and enter, and was discovering that the ordinary relationship between those two actions had been quietly rearranged. He could get in, of course. That was not the question. He held positions in this castle that were not purely administrative, and the wards that ran through its walls were not fixed points of architecture, so much as agreements with a building that had known him for nearly 4 decades. He could dissolve an interior ward if he chose. He had done so once before, in a genuine emergency, and Poppy had not spoken to him with any warmth for 6 weeks afterward. He did not choose to dissolve this one. "Is he alive?" he asked. The door gave back silence for a long moment, and then, "Yes." "Sleeping?" "Unharmed?" "Yes." He stood for a moment more. The question he had asked was the only one that genuinely mattered, and she had answered it. Everything else, the ministry notification, the sealed door, the inquiry she had referenced as though it were already a scheduled event, was the consequence of whatever her instrument had found, and he was not going to argue about what her instrument had found, which was itself a kind of answer. The evidence Pomfrey held was accurate. He had always known that evidence existed. He had simply assumed, for 30 years, that no instrument would ever locate it in a first-year health assessment conducted without his knowledge on the first night of term. He had not accounted for Poppy's thoroughness. He had not, in truth, accounted for Poppy at all, and he was aware that this said something about the assumptions a person accumulated over 30 years of being deferred to. "Good," he said. "Then I'll wait until morning." He walked away. His footsteps were unhurried on the stone, which was, he recognized, itself a kind of statement. The sound of a man who was not frightened, or who had decided not to sound it, or who had spent so long maintaining that particular sound that the distinction no longer applied. Pomfrey stood on the other side of the sealed door and listened to his footsteps go. She had prepared herself for argument. Not anger. Dumbledore was never angry in any way you could point to directly. But resistance. An explanation that would require her to either accept or refuse. Some form of pressure that would have tested her certainty and let her confirm it by holding. She had stood at this door with her authority assembled and her responses ready, and she had said what she intended to say, and now his footsteps were fading down the corridor, and there was nothing to refuse. He had asked only whether the boy was alive. Not, "What did you find?" Not, "Have you considered what you might be misreading?" Not, "Do you understand what you've set in motion?" One question, and when she answered it, he had said good, and left. She pressed her back against the sealed door and stood in the dimness with the amber lamp burning behind her, and the instrument's report on her desk and the child sleeping 12 feet away, and she understood something she had not been able to articulate an hour ago. In 30 years, she had never had occasion to wonder about certain things. She wondered now. She would not sleep tonight. She would check his vitals at 2 and at 4, and she would sit with her notes and her 3 times counted numbers, and she would be here in the morning to tell him what she had found, because someone should be, and she had already decided it was going to be her. Down the corridor, Dumbledore rounded a corner and encountered a figure coming in the opposite direction, the new defense against the dark arts professor, making his way toward the staircase that led to the staff quarters, his large purple turban slightly crooked from sleep or from a restless hour of not sleeping. Quirrell stopped when he saw the headmaster and performed a small, startled motion, the faint stutter already rising to his lips. "Professor Quirrell," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "A late night." "Headmaster, Yes, I couldn't sleep. That is..." He stopped. His eyes had moved with the involuntary precision of a frightened animal registering something it had not expected to the sealed door of the hospital wing, visible at the end of the corridor behind Dumbledore, the notification standard clear even in the dimness. Is someone ill?" "A precautionary matter," Dumbledore said. "Nothing to concern yourself with." He smiled with the warmth he had spent decades perfecting, and walked on. Quirrell watched him go. Then he looked for a moment at the sealed door, at the standard hanging in the frame, at the dark corridor around him. First night of term. The headmaster alone in the corridor at nearly 1 in the morning, walking away from the hospital wing with that particular, unhurried calm. In the back of his skull, in the place where Quirrell's own thoughts had grown thin and infrequent, something else considered this information. It was very quiet in there, in that hollowed space. The something else did not panic. It did not rage. It thought, with the cold patience of a mind that had been thinking through contingencies for longer than most people could imagine, and it adjusted. He woke, not knowing where he was. The ceiling was unfamiliar, high and white, and very still, nothing like the crack in the plaster he had memorized above his cupboard at the Dursleys, nothing like the water stain in the corner of his second bedroom that looked, if you squinted correctly, vaguely like a dog. The air smelled different from any air he knew, something medicinal and clean, antiseptic but older and more complicated, with an undertone of herbs he couldn't name, and something else he associated, distantly and imprecisely, with being looked after. He lay for a moment and gathered what he had. He was in a bed. The sheets were white and freshly pressed, and considerably nicer than any sheets he had ever slept in. There were tall windows along one wall, letting in grey September light, and when he found his glasses, which had been folded and set on the small table beside him, a thing people rarely did for him, he could see a long room with rows of empty beds stretching away in both directions, and shelves and cabinets along the walls stocked with bottles of many colours, amber and green and dark red, and neat stacks of folded white linen, and instruments he didn't know the names of. The hospital wing, he thought, sorting through what he knew about Hogwarts from the books he'd read before arriving. This was where you went if you were hurt or sick. He had located it on the floor plan in Hogwarts. A history about a week before the term started. He did that with places, worked out where things were before he got to them, because arriving somewhere already knowing the layout meant there was one less thing to feel lost about. He was not hurt. He was not sick, as far as he could tell. He tried to remember how he had come to be here. The great hall came back first. The candles, the ceiling made of sky, the long tables full of older students watching. The sorting hat, which was old and patched, and apparently able to talk, had told him he should be in Gryffindor, and the table with red and gold had made a noise, and then there had been a hand on his shoulder, guiding him out of the hall, before he had quite understood where he was going. After that, nothing. The memory simply stopped, as though someone had folded the page. "Good morning." He turned his head. A woman was sitting in a chair beside his bed, a clipboard resting in her lap, watching him with the patient, evaluating look of someone who had been watching for some time and was used to that being her role. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He considered this honestly. Fine was the word that came to him, and it seemed accurate enough. Slightly strange in the way of waking up somewhere new, but not unwell. "Okay," he said. "What happened?" "You're in the Hogwarts hospital wing. You've been here since last night." She set the clipboard aside. "My name is Madam Pomfrey. I'm the school's healer. I conducted a diagnostic examination while you were sleeping, and I need to speak with you about what I found." He waited. She was looking at him in a way that suggested she was measuring him for something, though he couldn't tell what. He stayed quiet. He had found that staying quiet was usually the fastest way to get to whatever the important thing was. "During the examination," she said, "I found something in your blood that should not be there. Magic that was put into you, without your knowledge or consent, beginning when you were very young, an infant most likely, and continuing until approximately 18 months ago." She was watching his face carefully as she said this. He was watching her face, carefully back. "How many times?" he asked. 47 distinct administrations. He turned this over. 47 was a large number. "What kind of magic?" "A compound designed to affect how you feel," she said. "To direct your feelings, Your sense of loyalty, your willingness to trust, your emotional orientation towards certain things and certain people. The wizarding world, most likely. The idea of coming to Hogwarts. The idea that magic was something you wanted. She folded her hands in her lap. Do you understand what I'm describing? I think so, Harry said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is that bad? Pomfrey looked at him. The pause that followed was longer than pauses normally were. Long enough that he noticed it. Long enough that he might have felt something in the space of it, if he had known quite what to feel. Yes, she said. That is very bad. He thought about it. He nodded. The nod felt like the right response, an acknowledgement of information received, an appropriate signal that he had understood. His chest did not feel tight. His eyes were not hot in the way they sometimes were before he cried. He felt steady and clear and slightly distant from the room, as though he were following the conversation from a step behind himself, watching himself receive information and respond to it correctly, and wondering vaguely, somewhere behind that watching, why there wasn't more to it than that. There should have been more to it. He understood that. If someone told you that magic had been put into your blood 47 times without anyone asking you, and that the magic was designed to change how you felt about things, there should have been something. He just couldn't find it. What did it make me loyal to? He asked. Exactly. I don't fully know yet. The compound's target profile requires further analysis. She held his gaze steadily. I've arranged for a specialist to assist. I expect to have a clearer picture within a few days. Harry nodded again. Then something occurred to him, a question that rose up from somewhere below where his words usually lived, and he asked it before he'd quite decided to. Does that mean my feelings about coming here aren't real? Pomfrey did not answer immediately. When Hagrid came to tell me I was a wizard, Harry said, and he was not sure if he was explaining to Pomfrey or to himself or to the quiet room, all three of which seemed equally plausible. I think I was happy. I wanted to come. I wanted to learn magic. I thought about it for weeks before the term started. He looked at the window, at the flat September light. Was that the potion making me think that? He turned back to her. She was quiet in a way that was different from her earlier professional quiet. This was the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be, and then deciding to be entirely honest. I don't know, she said. I'm sorry. I genuinely don't know yet. He looked at his hands, resting open in his lap. They were thin, his hands, in a way he had always known was different from how other boys' hands looked, without having had a specific word for it. He looked at them for a while, at the knuckles and the thin wrists, and the ordinary, unremarkable shape of them. The question was hanging in the air above his hands, and he could see it was important. He understood, in the clear and slightly distant way he seemed to be understanding everything this morning, that if the answer turned out to be yes, if the excitement and the wanting and the gladness had all been manufactured before he was old enough to walk, that was something very large to find out. He knew that. He could see the edges of it. He just couldn't feel them yet. He kept looking at his hands. Outside the tall windows, the grounds lay quiet under the grey September morning, and the castle made its low, constant, inhabited sound, and nothing in the room required him to feel anything yet, and he did not. The note that reached McGonagall said only that Madame Pomfrey required her presence at the hospital wing at her earliest convenience, which in Poppy Pomfrey's professional vocabulary meant now. She arrived at 9:05 to find the notification standard still hanging in the doorframe, and Pomfrey standing in the corridor outside, the door firmly shut behind her. Pomfrey's expression was the one McGonagall associated with very serious things. Not distressed, not frightened, but the particular concentrated steadiness of a professional who has understood something and is now managing its implications. The sight of it, combined with the standard and the sealed door and the fact that it was 9:05 on the second day of term, told McGonagall before a word was spoken that this was not routine. "Poppy," she said. "What's happened?" Pomfrey told her. She delivered the facts in the same order she had written them in her ministry report. Compound class, estimated number of administrations, temporal span, and McGonagall stood in the corridor and listened without interrupting, which took considerably more effort than it appeared. 30 years of teaching had given her a controlled face, a voice that could remain level under a remarkable variety of pressures. She used both now. The first thing that came to her, before grief or fury or any of the other things that would have been appropriate, was Privet Drive. She had sat there for a full day, 11 years ago, September 1st, 1981, in the form of a tabby cat on a garden wall, watching a woman in curlers set the milk out, watching a large man leave for work in a too-small car, watching a perfectly ordinary Muggle street go about its perfectly ordinary Muggle business, while she tried to understand what Dumbledore could possibly be thinking. When he had finally appeared that evening, she had told him directly. These were the worst sort of Muggles. She did not like it. Something about this felt wrong. Dumbledore had listened to all of it with the gentle attention he gave everything. Then he had overruled her. She had accepted that. She had continued, as she always did, to trust that the wider view he carried was wider than her own, and that the calculation she couldn't fully see was nevertheless sound. She had accepted it in 1981, and again in 82, and every year between then and now. What she was standing in the corridor of the hospital wing, doing at 9:05 on September 2nd, 1991, was discovering the quality of that acceptance. "Who did it?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was very good at level. Pomfrey looked at her carefully. The bond of blood charm, the blood protection embedded in his bloodstream, carries Dumbledore's magical signature. I recognized it. A pause. The potions themselves are still under analysis. I don't yet have a definitive origin for those. McGonagall's face did something she could not have named and would not have chosen to produce in front of anyone. But Pomfrey was not most people, and the corridor was empty. She stood very still and let it happen. The bond of blood was Dumbledore's. She had not been told the potions were Dumbledore's. Pomfrey had been careful about that. But the bond of blood alone was a thing she needed a moment with. And she took the moment, and then she brought her expression back to what it was supposed to be. "May I see him?" she asked. "Not yet. I'm sorry. I need to be certain he's had time to process what I've told him before anyone else comes in." McGonagall looked at the sealed door. She thought of the boy she had not quite seen last night. Gryffindor, the table had erupted. And the boy she had seen before, before Hogwarts, before he could walk or talk, when she had gone to Privet Drive and told Dumbledore it was wrong and been overruled. "Tell him," she said, "when you can, that Gryffindor is his house." Her voice remained level, though she put the full weight of what she meant into it. That is not something that was put into him. That was his own choice. The hat reads what is already there. Pomfrey nodded. It was a small, precise nod. McGonagall walked away down the corridor. The castle was waking around her. She could hear it, students beginning to move toward breakfast. the distant vibration of several hundred children starting their day. She passed a pair of second years who said, "Good morning," and whom she acknowledged with a nod, and whose faces she would not have been able to describe afterward. She was thinking about the boy inside the sealed room, and the man who had put him there, and the 10 years between a garden wall in Surrey and a hospital wing corridor in Scotland, and the particular quality of being right about something you had wished you were wrong about. She did not look back at the sealed door, because she did not trust what her face would do if she did. Pomfrey sent for Snape an hour later. He arrived without haste, in the unhurried manner he brought to most things he considered beneath a response, which was not, McGonagall had always observed, the same as things he considered beneath his notice. He was a very precise noticer. He simply preferred not to perform urgency where urgency had not yet been earned. Pomfrey met him in the corridor and gave him the scan data directly, without preamble, because she had worked out by now that preamble was not useful with Severus Snape. He took the sheets of diagnostic notation and read them. He read them in silence for a long moment, standing in the middle of the corridor with no expression on his face that could be called an expression. "How old was the first dose?" he asked. "My best estimate is approximately age 1. Pomfrey watched him. 1981. The corridor was very quiet. A portrait 3 frames down shifted in its sleep. "May I sit down?" Snape said. It was such an unexpected request. Snape, in 30 years of working in this castle, had never asked for a chair. That Pomfrey answered it before she had quite processed the asking. She conjured a chair. He sat. He sat in the corridor chair outside the sealed hospital wing door for a long time, with the scan data in his hands. He did not speak, and his face did not change, and you would not have known from looking at him what he was doing, whether he was reading the sheets again, or whether he had stopped reading, and was simply sitting in the only way available to him. Pomfrey had long since learned which silences were for breaking, and which were for leaving alone. She left this one entirely alone. Then he stood. The motion was abrupt, the decision already made before the body executed it. He folded the scan data and placed it carefully inside his robes. "I'll need my laboratory," he said. He walked away without another word. He moved through the castle at the same unhurried pace with which he had arrived, past the morning activity of a school beginning its second day, students drifting toward breakfast or toward their first lesson, the corridor filling with the sounds of a normal Tuesday. A cluster of first years flattened against the wall as he came through. He did not look at them. He was not thinking about them. He was thinking about Lily Evans, who had died in October of 1981, and whose son had been placed in a house that despised magic, and who had been given his first dose of obedience potions at approximately 12 months of age, and who had been receiving them at regular intervals for the next 10 years, and who was now sleeping in the hospital wing 11 years old and still alive, and who was going to need someone to tell him what had been done to him and what it meant, and who would need someone who could actually read a potions analysis to do that work. None of that was for Lily. He was clear about that, walking through the castle with the scan data folded against his ribs. He did not do things for the dead. He did not do things for children he had barely met and did not like. He did things for living principles. And his living principle in this case was that Lily had died so that her son could be free. And if someone had spent a decade quietly undoing that freedom, then Snape was going to know exactly how they had done it. He descended the stairs to his laboratory. The door closed behind him. He put on his gloves and laid the scan data on the bench and began to work. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the flu in the headmaster's office admitted Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, who stepped out of the green flames onto the hearthrug and immediately began brushing soot from his pinstriped suit. "Albus," he said. "What a business!" Dumbledore was at his desk, in the way of a man who had been there for some time and expected to remain there for some time more. His expression conveyed the mild, ancient warmth he brought to almost everything. "Cornelius, please, sit down." Fudge sat. He set his bowler hat on the arm of the chair, was obscurely uncomfortable about it being there, picked it up again, and held it on his knee. There was a quality to the office. The portraits, the silver instruments on the shelves, the bird perched on its stand, that had always made him feel slightly off balance, and he had learned over the years not to let that show. He had been in government for 23 years. He had managed difficult situations that looked considerably worse than this one, on paper. 2 dragon incidents, a rogue aura problem, the Azkaban business 3 years back that had required 17 memory charms, and a press statement that he was still privately proud of. It bothered him that this situation did not feel manageable in the way that dramatic situations sometimes could, because dramatic situations usually had clear mechanisms: denial, investigation, reassignment, controlled disclosure, a face that could take responsibility while the institution moved on. This one had Madame Pomfrey, who was not a mechanism he had prepared for. "My suggestion," Fudge said, settling into the warm and reasonable voice he used when he wanted to signal that everyone present was capable of finding a sensible solution, "is that we approach this as a medical matter, which is fundamentally what it is. A medical irregularity report, a quiet internal review, a ministry health tribunal if the findings require it. Discreet. Contained." He paused. "There's no reason for this to reach wider attention. For the boy's sake." Dumbledore looked at him. There was something in that look Fudge could not quite pass, which was unusual. He was generally a capable reader of what people wanted him to think they were feeling. "I believe," Dumbledore said, "that Madame Pomfrey acted entirely within her professional authority." And then he stopped. He did not add that the report was an overreaction. He did not suggest that something could be worked out. He did not give Fudge the small reassurance, the qualifying phrase, the implication that the situation retained some flexibility. He said that Pomfrey had acted within her authority, and he said nothing else, and the office was quiet around them, and the portraits of the old headmasters slept or seemed to sleep. It was, Fudge found, more troubling than protest. Protest meant there was something to argue with. He knew what to do with a man who said it wasn't as bad as it looked, or that the whole thing was being misread. He did not know what to do with Albus Dumbledore sitting in quiet, patient composure and offering him nothing at all to work with. "I see," Fudge said. He stood and smoothed his suit. "I'd like to speak to the boy." "That will be Madame Pomfrey's decision," Dumbledore said. The hospital wing corridor was precisely as unwelcoming as its notification standard suggested. Fudge walked the length of it and stood in front of the sealed door and knocked. "The wing is sealed." Pomfrey's voice came from immediately the other side, in the manner of a professional who has conveyed the same information several times today and intends to continue conveying it as many times as necessary. "Madame Pomfrey." He brought out his ministerial voice, warm, broadly authoritative, the one he used at award ceremonies and ministry funding announcements. "This is Minister Fudge. I understand there's been a significant development, and I believe it would be in everyone's interest if we could speak directly. Have you received the report I sent to the Potions Regulation Office this morning?" He had. More precisely, his office had sent someone to intercept him via flu before he had even finished the first leg of the journey. The report had gone to the Potions Regulation Office. That much he had been prepared for. The initial notification Pomfrey had apparently sent the previous night had at least given him that much warning. What the second flu communication, arriving 15 minutes after the first, had told him was that a complete diagnostic report, compound classification, estimated administration count, full temporal distribution across a 10-year span, had been filed not only with the Potions Regulation Office, but with the head of magical law enforcement, separately and simultaneously. He had not known about the second filing until 40 minutes ago. The moment he had learned about it was the moment his understanding of what he was walking into had changed significantly. "I'm aware of the report," he said. "Then you'll understand that the patient is under my clinical care, and that under healer patient protection provisions, I cannot grant access without his informed consent." A pause that was both brief and final. When Harry Potter has been fully briefed on his situation and has expressed a willingness to speak with ministry representatives, I will notify the appropriate channels. Not before. "Madam Pomfrey," he maintained, through some effort, an even tone. "I am the Minister for Magic." "Yes," she said. "You are." Nothing followed. Fudge stood in the hospital wing corridor with his bowler hat in both hands and the notification standard in his eyeline, and the understanding, arriving now with the unhurried clarity of something he had been trying not to see since the second flu communication, that this was not a situation he could contain. The report was already on record at 2 separate ministry offices. Its contents were institutional, logged, filed. The window that existed, between now and whenever the Potions Regulation Office decided to act formally, was a window on Pomfrey's terms, and she had understood that when she filed the report, and she had filed the report anyway, and she had filed the second report anyway, and he was standing in a school corridor being told no by a woman who had no electoral concerns whatsoever. He was the Minister for Magic. She was a school nurse who had filed 2 reports to 2 separate ministry divisions before he had finished his breakfast. He looked at the door for another moment. The standard said, "Authorized entry by appointment only." He could, in principle, issue a formal ministerial order compelling access. That order would need to go through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for countersignature, the same department that had received her diagnostic report this morning. He would be issuing an order to override a healer's patient protections in the same building that had just filed documentation of a serious crime against the patient in question. He tried to imagine the profit headline that would result from that sequence of events, and found the exercise clarifying. He turned and began walking back toward the headmaster's office. He thought, as he walked, about what Dumbledore's particular quality of silence meant. The silence of a man who had nothing to hide, or of a man who had decided that denying things was no longer useful, and the fact that he could not determine which of those it was. He thought about the report sitting in 2 ministry filing systems simultaneously, and about how long it would stay in filing systems before someone with a reason to pull it did so. He was not yet ready to conclude that this couldn't be contained. But the version of it that remained inside these walls was considerably narrower than what he had walked in expecting, and it was growing narrower with each hour that the sealed door remained sealed. Ron had never shared a dormitory before. He had 6 brothers, but they slept in their own rooms at the Burrow, and the dormitory in Gryffindor Tower was different. 4 beds in a circle, other people's trunks, a boy called Neville who kept a potted plant on the windowsill and said goodnight to it, and a boy called Seamus who talked in his sleep. Ron had expected not to sleep well. He slept fine, mostly, except for Scabbers. Scabbers had always been a quiet rat, old, grey, missing a toe, and generally content to sleep at the foot of Ron's bed in a loose curl of fur that barely moved. He was not a rat who did things. He had been Percy's rat for years, and Percy said he had done nothing of note in all that time, which was fine by Ron, who had not asked for a rat and had no particular expectations of one. But twice this week, Scabbers had woken Ron at strange hours, scrabbling at the bedpost, nose working, body twitching in the way of an animal that had registered something it didn't like. By the time Ron was awake enough to notice, Scabbers had settled again and seemed to be asleep, and there was nothing to explain it. Ron lay in the dark on the third night and thought about Harry, which was becoming a habit. He didn't know why Harry wasn't here. The prefects, Percy, technically, who was being very Percy about the whole business, said it was a medical matter and that it was being handled. That was all Percy would say. Medical, being handled, nothing to worry about. Ron had not found this reassuring. He had known Harry Potter for approximately 6 hours before he went into the hospital wing and hadn't come out. That was not long enough to know someone, he thought. He had expected to know him better than this by now. In the Gryffindor common room the following afternoon, Fred and George were holding court from the 2 best armchairs near the fire, the way they always did when they had an audience. "The boy who lived," George announced, "checked into hospital before he even saw a classroom. Record time." Fred performed a small, appreciative bow, as though accepting an award on Harry's behalf. A few people laughed. Ron did not. He was looking at the fire and thinking that it was exactly the kind of joke that would have been funny to him a week ago and was not funny now, and that the difference was one train journey and a conversation about chess. He didn't say this out loud. He wasn't sure he had a right to feel it, given the 6 hours. He hadn't known Harry long enough to claim him as a friend, not properly. But whatever the thing was, the thing that had happened on the train, the easy back and forth of it, the fact that it had felt like a beginning, it had been a beginning, and now it was sealed behind a door with a notification standard on it, and Ron found he minded more than he had expected to mind. But he felt it. The owl found Draco on Thursday morning, at breakfast. He recognized his father's handwriting on the scroll before the bird had properly landed, and he took it with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned very early that reading family correspondence in front of other people required a controlled face. He excused himself from the table and went to a window alcove in the entrance hall where he could read it without being observed. The letter was short. His father was not a man who wrote long letters. He considered length a form of imprecision. It said that the situation at Hogwarts had come to his attention through sources at the ministry, that the matter appeared, for now, to be contained within the school, that Draco should continue his studies normally and not draw attention to himself, that his father expected to hear from him when there was more to report. For now, contained for now. Draco read the letter twice, then folded it small and put it in his pocket. He had grown up in a house where what letters did not say was frequently more important than what they said, and what this one did not say was considerable. It did not say that the adults had the situation in hand. It did not say there was nothing to worry about. It said contained, which was the word people used when they were not certain the thing would stay that way. Harry Potter had been at Hogwarts for less than 48 hours before whatever had happened to him happened, and his father, who knew people at the ministry, who moved through rooms in the ministry the way furniture moved through houses, present and largely unmovable, had written to his 11-year-old son to say that adults were, at this point, managing the situation. Draco was 11. He was not stupid. He understood that frightened adults were a specific and recognizable kind of dangerous, the kind that made decisions quickly and badly. He folded his arms on the window ledge and looked out at the grounds, and thought about what sort of boy could make adults frightened by the second day of term, and what it meant that this boy had been put in the same year as him. Harry was awake at 3 in the morning. This was not unusual. He had been waking at odd hours most nights this week, lying in the hospital bed, with the amber lamp burning low and Pomfrey asleep in her office, and the castle making its deep, settled sounds around him. The hospital wing was quiet at 3 in the morning, in a way that his cupboard at the Dursleys had been quiet. Not empty, but sealed off from everything else, a small pocket of darkness, while the world did its other things. He had always found that kind of quiet easier than most people seemed to. He didn't mind the waking. He had more things to think about than he had ever had at once, and the thinking seemed to prefer the small hours when there were no other demands on him. This week he had been told about his parents. Pomfrey had done it carefully, with the kind of precise factual kindness that he was beginning to understand was the only way she knew how to do difficult things. She gave you the facts, and the facts were terrible, and she stayed there while you processed them, which in his case seemed to mean sitting very still for a while and then asking questions. James Potter, dead at 31? Lily Potter, dead at 31? A man called Voldemort, a curse, a scar. He had taken this information in and had nodded at appropriate points and had asked what he thought were reasonable questions. He had not cried. He was aware that not crying about your parents being dead was unusual, and he had added it to the list of things about himself he was now not sure how to interpret. He was lying in the dark, thinking about Hagrid. Hagrid had come to the hut on the rock on Harry's birthday, and had said, "You're a wizard, Harry," and had handed him a birthday cake with pink icing. And Harry had felt something that he had been calling joy ever since, the largest, clearest, most recognizable feeling he could remember having. He had held on to it across the weeks before term, in Diagon Alley, in his room at the Dursleys, packing his trunk on the floor, as evidence of something. Evidence that something good was happening, that the world contained things worth going toward. Was that the potion? He lay on his back with the question above him in the dark and turned it over. He could not tell from the inside. He did not know what he would have felt without the potion there, had never felt without it, had no comparison available. He might have felt exactly that feeling for exactly the same reasons. A large man appearing with a birthday cake and a fact that changed everything, and the feeling might have been completely his own. Or it might not have been. He didn't know. The not knowing was the thing that stayed with him after all the other information had settled. He thought, I should be angrier than this. He thought about it carefully, the way you thought about a fact that seemed important, but wouldn't quite connect to anything. He should be angry. He could see that he should be. The anger was somewhere below where he could reach it, and the potion was probably in the way. And someday, he understood this intellectually. Someday when the potion was gone, it would all be there, waiting for him. The grief and the fury and whatever else had been piling up at the bottom of him since he was an infant. He looked at the ceiling and waited for morning. He had been in his laboratory for 9 days. This was not for Severus Snape, an unusual duration for concentrated work. He had spent longer in there on more obscure problems with fewer consequences if he got the reading wrong. What was unusual was the silence he had maintained around it. He had not updated Dumbledore. He had not filed interim notes with the Ministry. He had sent no correspondence and received almost none. The one exception being a brief message from the Potions Regulation Office confirming receipt of Pomfrey's original filing and noting that he, as the relevant expert on staff, would be contacted in due course. And he had filed that message without reply and returned to the bench. He had been thorough because the conclusion required it. You could not arrive at the conclusion he was arriving at on the basis of insufficient evidence. There had to be no room for an alternative reading, no ambiguity someone could point to and use, no gap between what the data showed and what he stated it showed. He had run each section of the analysis 3 times. He had cross-referenced the compound signature against every potions database available to him. He had verified the timeline with 3 separate dating methods. When he walked into the hospital wing corridor and said what he had found, every word he said would be provable, and he would be prepared to prove it in any venue that cared to ask. McGonagall was waiting when he arrived. Pomfrey had sent word to both of them simultaneously. He had seen the notation on the message, and McGonagall had reached the corridor before him, which told him nothing he hadn't already known about her, which was that she arrived where she intended to be before anyone expected her. She was standing against the opposite wall with her arms folded. Her expression was neutral in the way of a professional who had spent 30 years controlling it, and had therefore made it very good at conveying precisely nothing. Pomfrey's voice came through the sealed door before he had finished crossing the corridor. Severus. Poppy. He positioned himself across from McGonagall, rather than beside her. The arrangement put her face directly in his sight line, which would be useful. I'll begin. McGonagall said nothing. He began. The compound is not a commercially produced or academically catalogued potion, he said. It is a proprietary blend, formulated by someone with advanced and specific knowledge of loyalty-binding research. The person who made it understood developmental absorption rates. The dosing was calibrated across each administration to account for the child's age and body mass at the time, which is a degree of technical precision that requires either extensive training or access to academic literature that is not in general circulation. He paused. McGonagall's expression was unchanged. He continued. The research tradition the compound draws from predates Voldemort's first rise. Loyalty-binding work of this type was pursued in the decades before the war and largely abandoned afterward. Largely, but not entirely. The knowledge did not disappear. It became private. The name sat in the corridor for a moment. He had not used it in 4 years. He used it now because this was not a social occasion. The first dose, he said, was administered in November of 1981. Within 1 to 2 weeks of the 1st of November, my analysis suggests, though the margin of error in historical compound dating at this resolution is approximately 3 weeks. Harry Potter was approximately 15 months old. A pause. He was placed with the family in Surrey on approximately the same date. The dosing began within his first weeks at that address. McGonagall's folded arms tightened, fractionally. He noted it. The doses were not administered through wand magic, he said. Wand magic performed at a Muggle residence would have registered on the trace. The Ministry's monitoring system for underage magical environments was fully operational during the relevant period. There is no record of any trace detection event at 4 Privet Drive across the decade in question. The compound was introduced by non-wand means. The residue patterning at each administration layer is consistent with ingestion. The compound entered his system through food or drink. He placed the first sheet of the summary analysis on the ledge beside the door, where Pomfrey could take it at her discretion. Someone put it in something he ate or drank, 47 times over 10 years. He was quiet for a moment. He was aware, in the way he was always aware of rooms, of the quality of the listening on both sides of the door. The delivery mechanism, he said. Each administration left a secondary trace alongside the compound itself, the residue of the magical act that introduced it into the residence. That secondary signature has a distinctive class. It matches the transference pattern of house elf domestic magic. Neither of them spoke. House elves can apparate to Muggle homes without restriction, he continued. The Trace does not monitor their magic. A house elf can enter a Muggle household, perform domestic tasks and leave, and the Ministry's detection systems will find nothing. What they cannot suppress is the magical imprint left in whatever the elf handled, which is what I found in the residue layers at each dose, once I knew what the secondary signature class indicated. He placed the second sheet beside the first. I cross-referenced the secondary residue signatures against the house elf bond patterns held on record for this castle. Elves in active service carry a bond signature specific to their place of service, and the signature modulates depending on whose direct authority they are acting under at any given time. The signatures in Harry Potter's bloodstream are consistent with Hogwarts bonded elves. They are further consistent in their modulation, with elves acting under direct instruction from the headmaster's office, as opposed to general household or kitchen instruction. He stopped. The corridor was entirely silent. McGonagall was looking at the wall behind him. Not at him, at the wall, at some point slightly to the left of his shoulder, in the way of a person who has found the thing they were looking at too much and has moved their eyes elsewhere without any expectation of the elsewhere being better. Pomfrey's presence behind the sealed door was a kind of weight. The portraits at the far end of the corridor had stopped moving. No one in the corridor was speaking. The castle was making its ordinary sounds around them. Distant footsteps, the creak of a staircase, the indeterminate hum of several hundred people going about their mourning, and all of it was very far away. Snape waited. He had nothing to add. He had said what he came to say, and it was complete. "How certain are you?" McGonagall said. Her voice was level. He gave it that. "Certain enough to put my name on a ministry report." He held her gaze when she finally returned it to him. "Which I intend to do." She looked at him for a long moment. He returned the look without modification. She was not going to get a qualification from him. He was not wrong. After a moment, she appeared to understand this, because she looked away from him and looked at the door and was quiet, and then she left without another word. McGonagall walked to the end of the hospital wing corridor and turned and walked past the staircase that would have taken her down to her next lesson, which was due to begin in 9 minutes, and which she was going to miss, and walked instead toward the marble staircase that led to the headmaster's office. She had made this walk many times across 30 years. She had made it for guidance and for permission, and for the particular reassurance that came from talking to a man who seemed to carry more of the picture than anyone else in the room. She was not making it for any of those reasons now. She did not knock. She pressed the door open and walked in. The office was as it always was. The instruments murmured on their shelves. The portraits sat in their frames, some asleep, some not. Dumbledore was at his desk. He had not heard her come in, or perhaps had heard her and was waiting to turn, and she could not tell which was one of the things about him she had never been entirely sure of. She stood at the threshold for a moment. She looked at the back of his head. Silver hair, familiar posture, the ordinary, inhabited ease of a man at work in his office on an afternoon like any other afternoon, and she felt the full weight of what was between that image and what Snape had just told her in the corridor. 30 years. Absolute trust, more or less. The evidence that had just been placed in her hands. She waited for him to turn around. He was at his desk. That was the first thing she registered when she walked through the door. Not the instruments on the shelves, not the portraits watching from their frames, not the silver bird that rustled briefly at her arrival and then went still. Just Dumbledore at his desk, with his hands resting open on the surface in front of him, not clasped, not folded, simply resting there, and his eyes on the door, the moment she opened it. He had turned before she knocked. She had not knocked. He looked old. She had noticed his age across the years in the ordinary way, the beard a little longer, the lines deepening in their familiar places, the ordinary accumulation of decades on a face that had always carried them well. She had not noticed it the way she was noticing it now, which was that he looked like a man who had been carrying something specific for a very long time, and who was finally sitting in the room where he was going to put it down. She stood in front of his desk. She had not taken a chair, and would not. "Tell me it isn't true," she said. He did not answer immediately. She had known him for 30 years, and she could tell the difference between the pause of a man choosing his words and the pause of a man deciding where to begin. This was the second kind. "It is true," Dumbledore said. He said it without qualification, without the gentle redirection she had watched him employ across hundreds of difficult conversations. The slight reframe, the partial acknowledgement, the way he could say something true and insufficient at the same time, and make you feel that the insufficiency was yours. He said it plainly. Yes, he had administered the compound. He had done it through a house elf, acting under his authority as headmaster, which was why the magical signature had read from the Hogwarts Elf Bond Register. 47 doses. 10 years. The first administered in November of 1981, in the first weeks after Harry Potter was placed at 4 Privet Drive. "The Dursleys despise magic," Dumbledore said. "You know this. You told me yourself in 1981 that they were the worst sort of muggles. And you were right. And I overruled you. And you accepted it. A child raised in that household, told for 11 years that magic was abnormal, punished every time it surfaced in him, surrounded by people who actively wanted him to be ordinary. That child might arrive at Hogwarts at 11 years old without the capacity to choose this world. Or he might choose it initially, and then, finding it hard and dangerous and full of people who wanted things from him, find a reason to leave." His voice was even. Not defensive, not apologetic. Even. The prophecy required him to face Voldemort willingly. Not under compulsion, not out of ignorance. Willingly, with the full sense that this world was worth the cost of defending it. I could not manufacture that at 11. I could not leave it to chance. She was quiet. She was standing very still, because standing very still was the only option available to her that did not involve saying something she had not yet decided to say. She was thinking about the boy she had overflown Surrey watching in October of 1981, the tabby cat on the wall. Dumbledore arriving at midnight, and her telling him what she had spent all day thinking, and him listening, and him deciding she was wrong. She was thinking about all the years between that night and this morning, and the particular weight of trust across a long span of time. "Neville Longbottom," she said. "He also lost his parents to Voldemort. He also could have been the child the prophecy described." Dumbledore looked at her without surprise. He had expected this question. She had prepared it in the corridor before she came in. But she understood, asking it, that he had also prepared for it. "Neville was raised by his grandmother within the wizarding world," Dumbledore said. "He grew up surrounded by magic. It was never in question that he would choose it. There was nothing to choose. It was simply his world, the only world he had ever known. Harry was different. Harry was placed outside. The choosing had to be made from a position of alienation from everything I was asking him to return to." A pause. Neville never needed to be convinced to stay. The answer was consistent. That was the part she had not been prepared for. Not the confession, which she had been preparing to receive since Snape's corridor report, but the coherence of it. The logic held. Every step of it was followable. She could trace his reasoning from the 1981 decision through every dose across every year, and understand exactly how a very intelligent man had arrived at a monstrous conclusion through a chain of individually defensible thoughts. She had spent 30 years watching him be right about enough things that she had stopped interrogating the framework that produced his conclusions. She had believed in the framework. She had let it stand in for interrogation. She wondered, standing there, how many other things she had accepted on that basis, how many times she had walked away from a conversation thinking the concern was hers and the wider view was his, and had been correct about that, and had let the pattern of being correct become a reason not to ask the next time. She heard the door. Snape stood in the entrance. She had sent him a message before she came up, only the time and the location, nothing else. And he had arrived without hurry in the way he did most things, and he had been standing in the doorway long enough to have heard what he needed to hear. His face was what it always was. Still, precisely attended, telling her nothing about what was happening behind it. She watched him watch Dumbledore finish. Then Snape said quietly, "Lily died so her son could choose." He let it be quiet for a moment. "You took that from him." Dumbledore looked at Snape. Snape returned the look without expression. The office held its breath. Then Snape turned and walked out. He did not close the door. It swung shut slowly behind him, and they were alone, and Dumbledore did not speak, and McGonagall did not speak, and the silence in the room was the shape of everything that had been said, and everything that could not be answered. She looked at Dumbledore for a moment longer. He was looking at his hands. Not at her, not at the instruments, not out the window at the September grounds. At his hands, resting open on the desk, the same position they had been in when she walked through the door. She could not read his face from where she stood, and she found, for the first time in 30 years, that she did not want to. She left. The hospital wing corridor was empty when she reached it, the notification standard gone from the door frame. Pomfrey had taken it down, sometime in the last hour. The door itself was open, not sealed, not locked, open, with Pomfrey standing to one side of it in the manner of a person who has been standing in exactly that position, waiting for exactly this. "He knows," McGonagall said. Dumbledore confessed. Pomfrey looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door. McGonagall went in. Harry was sitting up in his bed. He had his glasses on and his hands in his lap, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he sat, still, contained, giving nothing away, in the posture of a child who had learned very early that being difficult to read was a form of protection. He looked at her when she came in. He did not ask what had happened. She was not sure whether he already knew something had shifted, or whether he was simply accustomed to adults walking in and beginning whatever they had come to begin. It occurred to her, looking at him, that she did not know which of those things was more troubling. She could not think of anything adequate to say. She had 30 years of inadequate things she could have said to him at various points over the course of his life, and she had not said any of them, and she could not compress that failure into a sentence now. She was thinking about the infant in the basket on the Dursleys' front step, which she had not seen with her own eyes. She had left the street before Dumbledore placed him, but which she had imagined many times since in the way of things you wished you had stopped. She had not stopped it. She had objected and accepted the overrule and carried on, which was a thing she was now going to have to live alongside. She pulled a chair beside his bed and sat down. She did not tell him what Dumbledore had said. She did not tell him what Snape had said, quietly, in a doorway, in the only way Snape would ever be capable of advocacy. She did not say, "I'm sorry, though she was, or I should have fought harder in 19801, though she should have. She sat beside his bed, and he sat in his bed, and the afternoon light came through the tall windows, and she stayed. After a while, Harry said, "You don't have to stay." "I know," McGonagall said. She did not leave. The door was open. That was the first thing Harry noticed when Pomfrey came in from the corridor, and the second thing he noticed was that she was not carrying anything. No potions tray, no diagnostic sheets, no ministry correspondence. And the third thing was that she had her hands at her sides and was looking at him in a way that was different from the careful, professional attention he had grown accustomed to across the last 3 weeks. "The wing is no longer sealed," she said. "You may walk in and out as you choose. The notification standard has been removed." Harry looked at the door. It stood open in the way of a door that had decided to remain open, propped, perhaps, or heavier on one side, or possibly Pomfrey had charmed it. Through it he could see a section of corridor outside, stone floor, grey stone wall, a corner of a portrait frame at the far edge of the angle. It was very ordinary. He had spent 20 days on this side of it. "Thank you," he said. Pomfrey regarded him. He had learned to read what was in her face without her having to name it. Concern overlaid with professional restraint. Concern she chose not to express directly, because he had not asked for it, and because she was very careful about giving people what they had not asked for. He had come to find this quality in her easier than almost anything else about her, which was saying something, because most of what she had told him over the last 3 weeks had been difficult, and she had told it to him plainly. He was more grateful for the plainness than he had known how to say. "Supper finished an hour ago," she said. "I can arrange something brought up if you'd like." "I'm all right," he said. She did not argue. She straightened something on the bedside table that did not need straightening, and then she left him alone with the open door. He sat in the posture he had spent most of 3 weeks in, cross-legged, back straight, hands loose in his lap, and looked at the door and thought about what it meant that he was looking at it and not moving toward it. He knew the shape of the corridor. He knew the castle's sounds through the stone, footsteps, voices, the distant creak of certain staircases, but he knew them the way you knew things you hadn't seen for yourself, at one remove, as reports rather than experiences. The Hogwarts he knew was the hospital wing, and what it sounded like at 3 in the morning. He was not afraid of the corridor. He was uncertain about what came after it. He sat in front of the open door and watched the light on the stone change as the evening settled in. An hour later, someone appeared in the doorway. Tall for 11, or tall seeming, it was partly the arms, still too long for the rest of him. Red hair, pale and freckled, a look of someone who had decided to do something and was committed to seeing it through. He was carrying a plate with a cloth napkin over the top, held out in front of him in the manner of someone who had settled on this as the thing to do with his hands. Ron Weasley. They had shared a compartment on the Hogwarts Express and eaten all of Ron's sandwiches and talked about Quidditch and wizard cards. And then Harry had gone into the hospital wing that same night and had not come out again for 20 days. He remembered the train at a small distance, like something he had read rather than lived. "I got this from," Ron started, and then reconsidered the sentence. "They said you missed supper." "So." He held the plate out a little further, by way of completing the thought. Harry took the plate. He pulled the cloth back. Chicken, roasted potatoes, something green that looked like peas, still warm. He had not registered being hungry until the moment the plate was in his hands, and now he was, sharply, and he ate a forkful of the potato. "You can sit down," he said. Ron sat in the chair beside the bed with the speed of someone who had been hoping to be invited. He folded his hands on his knees. He appeared to search for something to say and conclude that he couldn't find it, and they sat in a not uncomfortable quiet while Harry ate. He was partway through the chicken when he heard steps in the corridor. Hermione Granger came through the doorway with a stack of textbooks balanced in both arms, her bushy brown hair pushed back from her face, wearing the expression of someone who had a plan and had organized themselves for its execution. She stopped briefly to assess the room, Harry on the bed, Ron in the chair, and then she crossed to the chair on Harry's other side and sat down with the efficiency of someone who had already decided she belonged there. "I thought you might want to know what you've missed," she said, and set the stack on the foot of his bed by subject and opened the top one on her lap. "We've covered 3 chapters of Transfiguration, 2 chapters of Herbology, and the first 2 theory sections of Charms. I've been taking notes on how McGonagall prefers answers to be organized, and Professor Flitwick seems to prefer demonstrations of understanding over citation, so I've been tracking that separately." She smoothed the page of the textbook with 2 fingers. "I've already organized them in order. We may as well go through them." "You didn't have to do that," Harry said. "I know," Hermione said, and looked up briefly in a way that conveyed that she had considered this and was at peace with it, and then she looked back down and began to read aloud. She read quickly, with emphasis on the things she personally found interesting and slight pauses before terms she was certain of. Harry did not follow every word. He followed the shape of it, matter-state conversion, matching visualization to wand movement, and found that following it required very little of him, which was exactly the right amount at this particular moment. Beside him, Ron had produced a fork from somewhere, and was eating from the plate at intervals. Harry noticed and did not object, because the plate was mostly Harry's, and Ron seemed to know this, and was eating from the edges of it in the way of someone who had grown up knowing the etiquette of shared food without ever being told it explicitly. At some point, the corridor outside had gone dark. Pomfrey had not appeared to announce visiting hours. Hermione had progressed from Transfiguration into Charms theory, her pace dropping slightly as she got tired, her pauses between paragraphs a little longer, and Ron had stopped eating and was slumped in his chair with the comfortable gravity of a tall boy who had decided to settle in. Harry had his back against the headboard, and his legs stretched out, and the Transfiguration notes open on the blanket in front of him, and he was not, he realized, thinking about Dumbledore's confession. He was not thinking about the ministry, or the compound, or the report in 2 separate ministry offices, or the things that were still waiting for him once the potions finished clearing. He was listening to Hermione read about wand movement theory and watching Ron decide, in the slow, deliberate manner of someone choosing from a range of options, whether to close his eyes. He thought, "When Ron handed me the plate, I felt something." He held this thought carefully. He had been trying, since Pomfrey explained the potions, to sort between what was chemically produced and what wasn't, to catch himself feeling things and determine where the feelings came from. He had not managed to determine very much. The difficulty was that he had no reference point. The compound had been in his blood since he was 15 months old, and every feeling he had ever had in his life had been shaped by its presence. He had no memory of feeling anything without it. But the thing that had moved through him when Ron held out the plate, the specific, brief, uncomplicated warmth of it, that was different from what he knew of the compound's effects. The compound had made him calm. The compound had made him want things. Hogwarts, belonging, the sense that the wizarding world was worth going toward. It had given him the shape of loyalty, a loyalty to something that had been decided for him before he could speak, What he had felt when Ron appeared in the doorway carrying a plate of chicken and potatoes was not calm and wasn't desire and wasn't pointing at anything useful. It had no function. It was simply warm, and it had arrived without any of the compound's usual mechanisms, from the uncomplicated fact of someone his age choosing to come through a door and bringing food. He thought, I don't think that was the potions. I think that was mine. He did not say this out loud. Hermione had stopped reading. The castle had gone quiet around them, and her voice had tapered off mid-paragraph, and she had not started the next one. And when he looked, she was looking at the page without reading it, her finger resting on a line. Ron's eyes were closed. He was breathing slowly. Harry looked at the open door. The corridor beyond it was dark and empty. He did not leave. The purging analysis ran to 11 pages. Snape had kept it to 11 deliberately. He could have written 40, could have documented every residue layer and every dating method, and every cross-reference in the degree of detail the work deserved. But 11 pages was what could be read by a healer and a deputy headmistress in a single sitting without losing the thread. He delivered it on a Thursday morning in Pomfrey's office, which was small and smelled of dittany and had a window that looked out onto the now empty corridor where the notification standard had hung for 20 days. McGonagall was already there when he arrived. Pomfrey set 3 chairs and poured tea that no one drank, and Snape placed the analysis on the table and said, Here is what you need to understand about the next several months. The compound had been in Harry Potter's bloodstream since infancy. Not since last year. Not since he was old enough to be aware of it. Since he was 15 months old, dosed through food and drink, absorbed through a developing digestive system, integrated into blood chemistry and brain chemistry and nervous system chemistry across 10 years of continuous growth. You could not remove something that had been part of a child's physical development for a decade the way you could flush a single potion administered last week. The compound was compacted into his blood in layers that corresponded to each year of dosing, and those layers were interwoven with the chemistry of a body that had grown up around them. He cannot be purged quickly, Snape said. Attempting to flush the compound in a matter of days or weeks risks destabilizing the psychological scaffolding that developed alongside it. His nervous system adapted over 10 years to the compound's presence. Removing it faster than the system can compensate may produce acute episodes, distress without identifiable cause, anger without a specific target, grief that arrives without context. The process must be gradual. The purging treatment he had prepared would work across weeks to months. During that period, Harry's emotional responses would be unpredictable in a particular way. He would swing between episodes of unusual intensity, raw, unmanaged feelings surfacing in a nervous system that had never carried them without the compound's smoothing effect, and periods of temporary flatness as old residue fought cleared blood. Neither state would be permanent. Both states would pass. How do we tell the difference, McGonagall said, between an episode and something that genuinely needs intervention? Duration and context, Snape said. An episode produced by the purging will not have a proportionate cause. If the intensity of his response matches the circumstances that prompted it, it is not an episode. It is him reacting to something real. He looked at her directly. We should allow for that distinction. There will be things worth being upset about. The ministry liaison had arrived on the Wednesday, a quiet man in ministry robes who had been shown to a room near the entrance hall, and who had, according to the castle gossip that reached Snape through the staff room, begun requesting access to Harry Potter's medical documentation within an hour of his arrival. Pomfrey had declined, citing healer-patient protection provisions in language she appeared to have had ready. The liaison had retired to the corridor. "The Ministry Observer changes document handling," Snape said. He returned the 11 pages to their folder and set it on Pomfrey's desk. "I have filed copies of the purging protocol and all diagnostic records directly with the Potions Regulation Office, time-stamped and independently received. If any documentation in this building is removed or altered, the Regulation Office will hold the original." There was a brief silence. Pomfrey looked at him with the expression she used when she had already thought of something and was deciding whether Snape had considered it fully. "He won't be able to compel access," she said. "Fudge's man. The healer-patient protections hold even over ministry observation." "I know," Snape said. "I filed the records in case the protections are tested." He stood. "They will be tested." He left the folder and walked out without further discussion. The corridor outside the hospital wing was empty, the door open, the air carrying the ordinary sounds of a school settling into its 4th week of term. Harry's first Transfiguration class began with a cat on the teacher's desk. He had been told about this by Hermione during the hospital wing evenings, in the same systematic way she had been telling him everything. Professor McGonagall was also an animagus, a registered one, and she began every first-year course with a demonstration to make the point that transfiguration was real and not theoretical, and that the distinction mattered. So when Harry walked in 3 weeks late and sat at the empty seat Hermione had saved, he knew the tabby sitting with its tail curled precisely around its feet was the professor. He watched her become herself in a single movement, one moment a cat, the next the upright, square-spectacled professor in tartan robes, without any intermediate state, and thought, that is nothing like the description in the textbook, and also exactly what the textbook means. He was 3 weeks behind every other first year. He could feel, abstractly, that this should trouble him. 11 years of evidence had established that being behind was a precursor to something bad. But what kept getting between him and the dread was the work itself. Magic was interesting. Not interesting in the way the compound had shaped his pull toward Hogwarts, that had been large and general, a feeling of wanting to belong here that lived in his chest like a compass needle. This was smaller and more specific. He wanted to understand why his match kept heating up instead of transforming, and whether it mattered that he was thinking about the end point of the needle or its material properties, and what the relationship was between what he pictured and what his wand actually did. He couldn't tell if that was the compound or his. By the second lesson, he had stopped trying to determine it. The question of what he genuinely wanted was going to take more time than he had available between now and the end of the class. In the meantime, he wanted to know how the transformation worked. That felt like enough to go on. Potions was a dungeon classroom that had never been warm. Harry sat between Ron and Hermione in the middle of the room and arranged his ingredients in the order the textbook specified, and waited. Professor Snape walked in from the back and stood at the front and looked at the class with an expression that conveyed, without being specific about it, that the class was only provisionally acceptable. He was the same in the classroom as he was everywhere else. Precise, cold, exacting, a person for whom competence was the minimum rather than the goal. He asked Hermione a question about bezoars, and received, clearly to his mild dissatisfaction, a correct answer delivered in more words than he wanted. He corrected Neville Longbottom 3 times in 20 minutes, with a kind of methodical precision that was neither gentle nor unkind. He walked between the benches and looked into cauldrons. He did not call on Harry. Not in the first class, not in the second. Snape walked past his bench, the way he walked past every bench, with the attention of someone assessing technical execution rather than the person performing it. He stopped at a cauldron that had produced the wrong color, said 3 quiet, decisive sentences, and moved on. He did not stop at Harry's. Harry decanted his first potion into its vial, a basic calming draught, pale blue, which he found immediately and quietly ironic. He labelled it and set it to the side, and Snape walked past without comment in the way he walked past every adequate vial. On the walk up from the dungeons, with Ron talking about Neville's melted cauldron handle and the particular smell it had produced, Harry thought about what had just happened. He was not sure what he had expected. Not kindness exactly, but some acknowledgement of what Snape knew, some softening of the laboratory's evidence. There had been none. Snape had treated him identically to everyone else who had produced an adequate pale blue calming draught, which was to say he had not treated him as a person at all, but as the work, and the work had been sufficient, and that was the end of it. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the right answer. Singling him out would have made a performance out of something that wasn't Snape's to perform. Not calling on him at all was the form that careful attention took when the person giving it had no intention of being observed giving it. He wasn't certain how he had worked that out. He thought it might be true. The library was mostly empty at 9:30 on a Thursday evening in late October, which was how Hermione preferred it. The populated hours were for people who wanted the books. The late hours were for people who wanted the thinking. She had been researching loyalty-affecting potions for 2 weeks. Not for any class. No class at Hogwarts had assigned the topic. But because Harry had been dosed with something for 10 years, and she did not know what it had done to him, and she found, with increasing certainty, that not knowing something she could theoretically find out was more uncomfortable than the difficulty of finding it. The library had a restricted section, but it also had 4 years of potions history journals in the open stacks, and those journals had told her rather more than she expected about the research tradition Snape had described in the briefing she had not been present for, but which Harry had summarized for her and Ron in the hospital wing on the evening of September 20th, carefully and without commentary, in the way he did most things. Scabbers was in her pocket. Ron had lent him with minimal enthusiasm, and the explanation that the rat was waking him twice a night with unexplained scrabbling, and he needed sleep before the charms practical. Scabbers had been quiet in transit, a dense, warm weight against her side, and she had expected him to sleep while she worked. He was not sleeping. He kept pressing his nose toward the opening of her pocket, and when she reached in to push him back down, she could feel his whole body vibrating with the particular tension of a small animal at high alert. She looked at him. He was grey and old, older than she would have expected a pet rat to be, with the slightly translucent quality of an animal past its natural span. He had been Percy Weasley's rat for years before Ron's, which would make him at minimum 12, and rats did not generally live 12 years. She had noted this, and added it to a mental list of things she had noted, and not yet had a reason to act on. He was looking toward the library door. Not scanning, not the side-to-side sweep of an animal watching for predators, looking at a specific direction, waiting to see if something came through it. She had read enough natural history to know the difference between prey fear and something else. Prey watched from above and to the sides, orienting to the widest possible field. What Scabbers was doing was more directed. He was not afraid of being eaten. He was afraid of something he could identify and was watching for specifically. She wrote in the margin of her research notes, Scabbers, library, late oct, watching door, not predator fear. Different. Then she went back to the journal. She had not mentioned this to Ron. She did not know what she would say. The anger arrived on Thursday afternoon without warning. Harry was in charms, Flitwick at the front of the room, the levitation charm they had been practicing for 3 weeks, when it was suddenly there, full and sharp and without an object, like stepping into a dark room and finding the furniture moved. He set his wand down and put both hands flat on the table and breathed. He knew what it was. Snape had described it precisely. Waves of unpredictable intensity as the purging cleared old compound from his blood, feelings arriving without targets, looking for shapes to fill. He had had easier days. After supper, he went outside. The grounds in late October were grey and cold, the sky low, the lake dark at its edges. He walked the path around the outside of the castle without going anywhere, because moving was something to do with a feeling that sitting still didn't allow. The cold helped marginally. He had his robes done up to the collar, and his glasses were fogging at the edges from the temperature change, and he thought, "This is without a target, and it will pass." He came around the east face of the castle and nearly walked into Professor Quirrell. Quirrell was coming from the angle of the castle wall, not from the main path, not from the entrance. He had his arms folded tight across his turban and his head down, and he looked up when Harry appeared, and the expression on his face was not the mild, nervous distraction of a man taking an evening walk. He looked startled. More than startled. He went very still, in the specific way of someone who had been doing something they should not, and had just encountered someone unexpected. It lasted only a moment, and then the familiar manner came back, slightly too fast, slightly too assembled. "P. Potter," he said. The stutter was worse than usual. "Goodness. Out for getting some air?" Yes, very good idea. The grounds this time of year are excellent." "Yes, sir," Harry said. Quirrell smiled in the way that did not reach any of the expected parts of a face. He made the small, conclusive movement of someone ending a conversation rather than completing one. "Well," he said, "good evening." And he walked past Harry at a pace slightly too fast for a casual walk, and disappeared around the corner toward the entrance hall. Harry stood on the path and looked at the corner where he had gone. The anger was doing something he had not expected it to do, which was make things clearer. Not calmer. It was still there. Still without a target, still a sharpness at the back of his throat that had no name. But it was cutting through something. The compound had been very good at smooth. It had processed incoming information through a warm, equable filter that reduced friction. Without it, friction was returning. The friction, he was beginning to understand, was the noticing. Quirrell had been coming from the direction of the 3rd floor. He had heard, on the 1st of September, Dumbledore say during the sorting feast that the 3rd floor corridor on the right-hand side was out of bounds to anyone who did not wish to die very painfully. He had filed it on September 1st, the way he had filed most things in those first days, from behind the compound's glass, as information received and stored without urgency. He was not behind the glass now. The 3rd floor, the right-hand side. Quirrell at 8:30 on a Thursday evening, arms folded tight, too startled to manage the stutter, coming from that direction, and not the path. Harry turned back toward the castle. He did not tell Ron and Hermione that evening. He sat with them in the common room while they argued about the correct wand angle for the levitation charm, and he thought about what he had seen, turning it over slowly. Not yet, he thought. Not until he knew what he was looking at. He was aware, thinking this, that 3 months ago there would have been no not yet. 3 months ago he would have processed the encounter as interesting information and stored it alongside everything else, and the compound's smooth, patient warmth would have given him no particular reason to decide what came next or push toward it. The anger was uncomfortable, and it did not have a target, and he would not have chosen it. But it had found a use for itself. It had given him a reason to do something other than wait for adults to tell him what to think. He went up to his dormitory and looked at the ceiling for a long time before he slept, thinking about the third floor and the thing Quirrell's face had done when he appeared around the corner, and what it meant that a professor could look, just for a moment, like someone who was frightened of being caught. The great hall was loud with Halloween, and Harry was not in it. He had tried. He had gone as far as the entrance hall, and stood in the doorway long enough to register the noise. 100 voices, the smell of pumpkin pasties, the warm institutional light. And then the volatility had risen in him, like water rising in a room, and he had known, with the clarity the purging had been giving him these past weeks, that he did not want to sit in that noise and manage himself through it for 3 hours. He had turned around and gone back. He was in the third-floor corridor when he heard the footsteps. Not the right-hand side. He was nowhere near the door he knew was there. He was simply crossing to the staircase that would take him back toward Gryffindor Tower, and the footsteps were behind him, and he recognized them before he turned around, the slight drag of the left foot that he had noticed in the weeks since the October encounter on the grounds. Quirrell was not stuttering. That was the first thing. He spoke in the corridor with no hesitation, no false start, no sound of a man performing a limitation. "Potter," he said. "Good. I had hoped to find you away from the others." Harry did not move. He was aware of the empty corridor around him, the distant sound of the feast from somewhere below, the cold that lived in the stone at this level of the castle even in October. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which was faster than it had been a moment ago. The volatility in his blood was doing what it did, sharpening everything, removing the smooth distance between stimulus and response. He felt afraid. He noted the feeling and did not put it away. "You were on the grounds on Thursday the 24th, Quirrell said. He had stopped 6 feet from Harry. His hands were at his sides. "Near the east wall. You saw me. I need to know what you observed. And more than that, I need access to the signature in your scar. Just for a moment. Just enough to locate what I've been looking for." His voice was very even. Not the voice Harry had heard in class. Something underneath it, directing it. "It won't hurt." "I don't think that's true," Harry said. Quirrell looked at him. The look was strange, the face doing one thing and something behind the eyes doing another. He took a step forward, and Harry stepped back, and Quirrell raised one hand and reached toward Harry's forehead. He did not reach it. The burning started at Quirrell's fingers. Harry could see it. Not flames, but a whitening of the skin, a recoil that traveled up the hand before Quirrell could stop it. Quirrell made a sound that was not quite a word, and drew back sharply. He looked at his own hand. He looked at Harry. Something in his expression shifted. Then, footsteps from the end of the corridor. Fast ones. Dumbledore arrived with McGonagall half a step behind him, and the corridor changed immediately in the way of spaces that have been rearranged by the arrival of specific people. Dumbledore looked at Harry first, a single, assessing look that covered the full length of him, and then at Quirrell. His face was something Harry had not seen on it before. Not the warm, ancient composure, not the mild deflection. Just tension. Very still, and behind it, something that Harry thought, later, might have been grief. "Quirinus," Dumbledore said, and Quirrell turned around. Not Quirrell. What was wrapped in Quirrell? What had been using Quirrell's face to organize the stutter and the nervousness and the smell of garlic and the months of careful, patient searching through the castle's 3rd floor? It unwound itself from the performance of the man and addressed Dumbledore and the corridor with a different quality of presence. And then it turned its attention to Harry, and the turban came loose. Harry's scar exploded with pain. He pressed his hand against it and did not look away. The face on the back of Quirrell's head was chalky white and red-eyed and flat where a nose should have been, and it was watching Harry the way things watched you when they had decided you were relevant to their plans. "Harry Potter," said the voice that came from Quirrell's mouth, and was not Quirrell's. It was familiar in the way that things that have been afraid of you are familiar. Careful, particular, attending to the distance between you. You have been treated very badly by people who claimed to act in your interest. You understand this now. You understand what it means to have your choices made for you, to have your loyalty manufactured by those who told themselves it was necessary. A pause. I am asking for loyalty freely given. I am offering you the knowledge of what I am and what I want, and I am asking you to choose it. That is more than Dumbledore ever offered. The pain in his scar was considerable. Harry stood in the corridor with it and thought about what was being said. He thought about the compound which had been in his blood since he was 15 months old, and the argument that this, what was being offered now, was different from that, because now the manipulation was visible and named. He could see it. That was supposed to make it a choice. He thought, I don't want what you're offering. He wasn't sure if that was courage. He wasn't sure the distinction mattered. He had spent 2 months trying to sort between what was his and what had been put into him. And this was very simple. He did not want to help this thing get what it was looking for. Not because of the potions, not because of the compound's 10 years of manufactured loyalty to the wizarding world, because he had seen Quirrell's face on the grounds when he thought no one was watching, and he had seen what was in it, and he did not want to go toward that. No, Harry said. The corridor went very bright. He did not see all of what Dumbledore did. Some of it was behind him, and some of it was the pain still in his scar, and some of it was the particular limitation of being 11 years old with imperfect glasses in a corridor where several things were happening at once. He saw Quirrell's hands. He saw Quirrell fall. He heard Voldemort, the voice stripped of Quirrell's body, without a mouth to form it, with nothing to shape it but the air, say something that was not words exactly. And then the corridor was quiet, and Dumbledore was kneeling, and McGonagall had her hand on Harry's shoulder. And above them, very slowly, the turban settled on the stone floor, like something discarded. Pomfrey found them there 2 minutes later. Harry was sitting against the wall with his knees up and his head back, and his scar had stopped hurting, and he was cold. He was not calm. He noted the absence of calm, the way he had been learning to note the absence of things the compound had given him, registering it, not reaching for it. He was frightened, and he was shaking slightly, and he was very, very present in his own body, in a way that felt like standing in rain after years of watching it through a window. McGonagall sat beside him in the hospital wing for a long time without speaking. Pomfrey had checked him over and declared him physically unharmed, and then found things to do in her office that required her to be in her office, which Harry recognized as a version of the same thing she had done on the night she told him about his blood. If the potions were still there, he said. When I said no, if it was still the compound making me loyal, would it count? McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the window and not at him, which he had learned she did when she was deciding how to answer a real question rather than a manageable one. The hat chose you for Gryffindor, she said. The hat reads what is already there. It does not manufacture it. Harry thought about this. He wasn't sure he believed it yet. Wasn't sure he could tell, from the inside, what was already there, and what had been put there. Wasn't sure that question had a clean answer, and might never have one. He set it to the side of himself, where he kept the things that needed more time. Pomfrey opened the hospital wing door fully. not propped. She took the door off its charm entirely, so it stood open the way a door stood open when it had never needed to be sealed. She went back into her office without explaining. He didn't think she needed to. Harry looked at the open door for a moment. Then he got up, picked up his school bag from the floor beside the bed where he had dropped it on the way in, and walked through it. He had Transfiguration in the morning. He had decided to attend it. He had decided that himself, without any assistance, and the decision was not certain and not heroic, and was also entirely his. The corridor outside was dark and empty and cold, and he walked down it toward Gryffindor Tower, and the castle held him in the way it had held him since the 1st of September, and for the first time